Good afternoon, buenas tardes. My name is Adam Thornburg. I am from Global Medical Affairs at Roche Diagnostics, and I cover the GenMark Diagnostics portfolio. And today I'm going to talk to you all about the ePlex sample-to-answer solution, which is a rapid sample-to-answer solution for infectious disease diagnostics. And to start, I'm going to go over a little bit about the system itself. As I said, it's a sample-to-answer system. It consists of a touch screen, which is run by a base, and it's attached to towers that can be configurable to your laboratory depending on what size of patient population you have to diagnose. And each individual, Good? Okay. So each individual tower is attached to the base, and I'll touch upon how the instrument can be configured to your individual laboratories. And of course, in the towers are bays, and they are all independent analyzers that can run each individual sample that you're looking to test depending on the assay. And of course, there's indicators on the base to let you know how the system is performing. So if the system is ready to accept a cartridge, or if the system is in a running state or an error state, you can see from across your laboratory and decide what you would like to do from there. Everything on the system is onboard extraction, amplification, detection, and reporting, and that's all done within the cartridge. So you load your cartridges with your primary sample, you scan the cartridge at the instrument, insert it into an available bay, and the instrument does all of the processes on board. So you're minimizing your tech cost, your tech time, and your potential for errors. And all of our systems run in about 90 minutes for all of our tests, and we have 5 on-market tests today. We have 3 blood culture identification panels, 1 for gram-negative, gram-positive, and fungal organisms. And then we have 2 respiratory pathogen panels, 1 with and without SARS-CoV-2. And we also have a gastrointestinal panel in development as well. The instrument is fully random and continuous access, so you can maximize the flexibility of the different panels that you'd like to run in your laboratory at any time. And as I mentioned, the system is fully capable to be scaled up or down based on the laboratory needs. So you can have your smallest system, which is 3 bays, all the way up to 24 bays in a 4-tower system, running anywhere from 36 to 288 samples in a 24-hour shift. And again, this can be configured on any of the systems that you see on the screen here today based on what your laboratory needs are. The cartridges themselves are all single-use and self-contained, and you see the cartridge up on the screen there is a respiratory pathogen panel too. And this particular cartridge, Okay. This particular cartridge is color-coded so that you know exactly which cartridge you're running. And all of our cartridges are color-coded, like I mentioned. And you see that label contains cartridge ID, which is a barcode that will allow the system to scan in. And the cartridges are all programmed to contain and track all of the information that's associated with that particular cartridge. And then the accession barcode that you see on the bottom will help tie in your patient ID. So you can only run your patient sample and your cartridge within the same capability. You cannot run the wrong patient with the wrong accession ID. Underneath the labels, you'll have all of your wet reagents that are stored in blister packs that are exploded upon entering the cartridge into each individual bay. And on the back of the cartridge, you'll have your liquid reagent module and your printed circuit board. The liquid reagent module is where your extraction will start to take place, and the printed circuit board is where all of the electrowetting takes place, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Our cartridges are universal, so each individual cartridge is exactly the same and based on the same properties, and you can add the designated primers and probes to it to make each individual assay for all the targets that you wish to detect. The input volumes can range anywhere from 50 to 400 microliters and are optimized for each individual assay that you're running. And there's no added user reagents as well. So the rationale behind our technology is electricity. We have taken our previous generation instrumentation, which is all off-board extraction and PCR and detection, using electrosensor detection, which is a ferrocene label brought down into close proximity to a gold electrode, which is what you see in the middle of the screen there. And that's how we run our microarray systems. So it's all detection based off of a single strand of PCR product that's attached to a microarray that is on top of a gold electrode. And this electrochemical detection allows us to have a really high signal to noise ratio and a low background, so it's something that you get as a little bit of a problem with fluorescence-based assays. And in order to make this a rapid sample to answer product, we combined this with electrowetting, which is precision fluid management using digital microfluidics. And I'll show you a video that kind of embodies that in just a moment. But essentially, our cartridges have no moving parts inside of them, so the electricity takes care of everything that you have to do. And if you could go ahead and play the video now, hopefully it will play for you guys. There we go. So this is a real live look at the electrowetting technology in process. And what happens after you place the cartridge inside of the instrument, it should basically explode with the blister packs, and the blister packs get all the wet reagents onto the cartridge, and an oil slick will go across the PCB board. There it goes, thank you. So there's a little bit of music as well. But essentially what you see here is the inside of that printed circuit board. And inside of the printed circuit board are all the little tiny droplets of microfluidic movement.
The ePlex system fully automates molecular testing, including sample preparation, extraction, amplification, and detection to deliver rapid sample-to-answer results.
So what you see here is the PCR processes are taking place in each one of our 4 PCR lanes, up to 8 PCR reactions. And this is after extraction has already taken place using bead snap technology. And we rehydrate all of the primers during the digital droplet movement. So upon this, the PCR finishing, the digestion will complete, and they'll wash over the microarrays, and the microarrays are where all of the capture probes are.
E-sensor detection technology to deliver superior sensitivity and specificity.
And as you can see, something that's not analogous to a capture probe will float by, but something that is will hybridize immediately to the capture probe, bringing that ferrocene label in close proximity to the gold electrode. And when that gold electrode is hit with electricity, there's an electron transfer, and that's how we're able to measure whether or not DNA is contained within that particular capture probe. And for the interest of time today, I'm going to talk about our blood culture identification panels. As I mentioned, we do have other panels that are in development, and we have a respiratory pathogen panel that's on market today. But for the interest of our time, and for Dr. Boyle's talk when she comes up, I'll talk to you a little bit of background about our gram-positive panel first, which was our first panel to get FDA clearance. And you can see over on the right-hand side of the screen is our full target listing, and what you'll probably notice is that it's very large. So we aim to have broad inclusivity of both important pathogens on this panel as well as common contaminants. And what we found in our clinical study of over 2,000 samples between clinical and contrived samples was that we were highly inclusive for all gram-positive bloodstream infections in our clinical study, and that only 2.2% of isolates were off panel. So that means that roughly 98% of the clinical isolates that were tested in the clinical study were detected by our panel. With this panel, we have more speciation of important gram-positive pathogens like your enterococci, your streptococci, and your staphylococci. And we also have differentiation of your common resistance genes like MEC-A and VAN-A and VAN-B, but we also, in addition, have MEC-C for your emerging methicillin resistance. Aside from that, the 2 other things that set our panels apart from some of our competition in the gram-positive sense are our contamination rule-out targets. So you'll notice that we have 2 groups of bacilli, Corynebacterium, Cutibacterium, Lactobacillus, Micrococcus, etc. And the ability to rapidly identify a contaminant in some of these bloodstream infections is lending to basically being able to either de-escalate or completely stop antibiotics altogether, which should in turn save money. And what the investigators in the clinical study found was that these expenditures per institution could be anywhere from $1.8 to $1.9 million. And also we have 2 pan targets at the bottom of the list there that you can see, and these are really important for detecting gram-negative infections in polymicrobials and also certain candida infections that might be present to either prompt additional testing, continue empiric coverage, or add antifungal coverage to your current regimen for your patient. And next we have our fungal pathogen panel, which is currently the largest molecular offering for a syndromic panel for fungal infections. And what you'll notice here is, again, a very large clinical study that was tested in the United States, and it is the largest breadth of a panel. It's accurate, it's easy to use. This is what the investigators noted in the study. And one of the great things about our panel is because it's molecular, we were able to detect 4 additional co-infections with candidas that were not expected by standard of care and that were all confirmed by PCR and sequencing. And we were also the first assay to contain multi-drug resistant Candida auris. Aside from having many of your emerging candidas and some of your rapidly emerging candida species, we also added in 2 additional pathogens which were paramount for detection, which would be your cryptococci and your rhodotorula, which has a really high mortality rate and is not considered to be covered by normal candidemia antifungal regimens. And then we also added the fusarium target, which also has a very high mortality, especially in your neutropenic patients. And finally, our third panel for our blood culture trio is our gram-negative panel, which when we got this cleared, the investigators noted that currently on market today for your molecular offerings, this would be your broadest coverage that you could have possible. So between the 3 panels, we now have the most comprehensive rapid molecular ID in bloodstream infections. And we wanted to make sure on our gram-negative panel that we included a lot of your anaerobes, multi-drug resistant organisms, and your common resistance genes for ESBLs and carbapentamases. And with those ESBLs and carbapentamases, what we saw was we had a really high accuracy and performance for these particular organisms to phenotypic AST as well as other molecular comparators. And we also noted there's a lot of advantages for the pan targets on this particular panel as well. The pan-gram positive was detected in 22% of co-infections with the gram-negative panel, and only one of these co-infections actually detected a gram-positive pathogen, and only one of them was seen on gram stain in standard of care. And we also wanted to make sure you had faster management for your multi-drug resistant organisms, so you could provide actionable information to places like your hospital epidemiologists, infection preventionists, and bed management teams, as well as including other things that might be harder to grow, like your Fusobacterium and your Bacteroides. And I'll touch briefly upon the pan targets. It is a lot of shading and there's a lot of targets, but what I wanted to show you all today is the sheer breadth of the panels all in one slide, so you can see exactly what kind of coverage you'd be looking at with the offering of the 3 panels together. And then what the pan targets will do is aid in detecting mixed infections if you are running a single panel so that you don't miss an infection. And also if you make an error reading the gram stain or there's a gram variable organism, the pan targets will aid you in a proper detection of the organism that you're looking for. So the shaded region on each one of the panels will give you an understanding and an idea of what the pan targets on the other panels cover. So if we start at the right-hand side and we look at the orange shading, you'll be able to see that our pan-candida target on both the gram-positive and the gram-negative panel cover most of your 4 circulating prominent candidemia targets. So your albicans, your glabrata, crucei, and parapsilosis. And if you move into the middle panel, you'll see that the pink shading covers the whole entire gram-negative panel. So our pan-gram-negative target covers everything that you would see on the gram-negative panel, as well as up to 95% of all gram-negative bloodstream infections. So it's actually very, very diverse and can detect much more than what's even shown here on the screen. And for the pan-gram positive, which is shaded in blue on the left-hand side, you see we took a little bit more of a conservative approach so that you didn't detect common contaminants in your pan target, and you're really only detecting things that are gram variable, like your bacillus species, as well as most of your pathogenic species, which would be your enterococci, Staph aureus, and streptococci. And with that, I am going to just give you an idea of where GenMark sits. The GenMark system and the ePlex system fits in the Roche setting. So GenMark was acquired by Roche. Okay. GenMark was acquired by Roche in April of 2021. And they did so to make sure that they had a complete offering for PCR systems and have a high quality solution for every setting that you can possibly have in your laboratory. So as you can see, our syndromic panel solution fits directly in between our high efficiency solutions like your Cobas 5800, 6800, 8800, and your Liat point of care system. And on each side you can see you have your Alexis immunoassay analyzers and your at-home testing pilot rapid antigen test, so that you can make sure that you have coverage for each individual portion of your portfolio in your laboratory, and Roche can help with that. And I won't get into all of the semantics in the bottom of the screen, but it gives you an idea of how the GenMark ePlex system fits in with the rest of the Roche portfolio. And with that, I am going to wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions after we're done, but I would like to introduce Professor Brita Boyle, who has a long list of credentials there. She has been gracious enough to fly over from Dublin, Ireland, where she is a consultant microbiologist at the St. James Hospital in the Department of Clinical Microbiology, and has been working with ePlex for quite some time and produced a lot of really nice real-world data on some cost savings using the ePlex blood culture identification panels, as well as some healthcare worker time savings during the pandemic. So with that, I will wrap up and invite Professor Brita Boyle.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you very much for that introduction. I would just like to say it's a beautiful country so far, what I've seen of it, and I had a very interesting morning where I met with some members of the Inverna group, and there's some excellent collaborative work been done in relation to stewardship, infection prevention and control, and diagnostic stewardship. So the title of my talk is Rapid Blood Culture Identification and Resistant Determinants Helps Improve Patient Outcomes and Reduces Healthcare Costs as Part of a Diagnostic Programme. So here are my declarations. Just to note, the first evaluation was performed with the support of Synthet Scientific. So really what we're talking about here today is diagnostic stewardship. And I hope to provide some insights into how the rapid results generated from molecular diagnostics and blood cultures will help us improve patient outcome and reduce healthcare costs. I think it's just important to note that based on our own epidemiology in our hospital, what we base our empiric sepsis treatment is piperacillin, tazobactam, and amikacin and aminoglycoside as our initial empiric therapy. And obviously, if we have a system whereby we can exclude ESBLs, etc., it allows us to be able, instead of giving 5 infusions, we can reduce that down sometimes to 1 infusion with ceftriaxone. So obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was extremely useful in reducing healthcare worker time and also in reducing the healthcare worker and patient contact time. This would have been pre-vaccination. In addition, I want to review the analytic performance of all 3 of the panels, the gram-positive, gram-negative, and fungal pathogen panel. So the top arrow just refers to where I'm from, which is the Western Isle of Europe. It's Ireland, and we're north of the equator. Obviously, we're currently south of the equator. So although there's a difference, we really have the same diagnostic dilemmas. Usually, when I am listening to a talk, one of the things I want to know is something about the background of the person, to see if there's any clinical similarities and does their clinical practice mirror my particular clinical practice. So I'm a full-time clinical microbiologist in a 1,000-bed tertiary academic centre. It has a number of specialities, but in particular in relation to bloodstream infections. It has a stem cell transplantation unit, which is the 3rd largest between the UK and Ireland, and we've recently started doing CAR-T transplantations. We also have a large cancer institute with a number of clinical trials ongoing, And we also have 3 critical care or intensive care units. So they're cardiothoracic, general, and obviously during the pandemic we had a COVID-19. So we were fortunate we could upscale our critical care capacity to over 60 beds during the pandemic. We also have the referral hospital as part of the National Burns Unit, and we have additional ICU or critical care capacity there. And we're also the National Centre for HIV and GUIDE within our country, and the Clinical Microbiology Laboratory has 4 reference laboratories. So as you can see, it's a busy place, and we have 4 whole-time equivalents of clinical microbiologists, and we lead on the laboratory on infection prevention and control. We have a clinical commitment, and we share antimicrobial stewardship with our infectious disease colleagues. And in addition, we have 4 reference laboratories. The European mean is 13, so we are resource deficient and we need to be as efficient as possible. The hospital was founded in 1667 and the site was selected in 1730 for a founding hospital. As you can see there, a picture of it. We're currently building the most expensive hospital in the world, the Children's Hospital. So it's a busy, developing and evolving campus. Now, if you ever get the opportunity to visit Ireland, this is Trinity College Dublin. So this is our academic partner, and it's in the top 100 universities, similar to the University of Buenos Aires, which is really quite an achievement when you think about the population of Ireland, which is under 5 million. This is the beautiful long room. It's in Trinity College, and it was founded Trinity College by Elizabeth I. And it has a very special requirement known as the legal deposit book pertaining to Oxford, Cambridge and Trinity. So what that means is that each of those universities get a free copy of a book when it's published, and they have to be stored. So originally this library started off as a single-storey library and had to expand. And currently in the mountains surrounding Dublin, there are a number of large-scale buildings housing books on every subject in the world through this legal deposit book requirement. So this is the front of the medical school in Trinity. This is in the centre of Dublin City. If you go through those wooden doors, it brings you into Quadrangle, and it's a Georgian campus. And Trinity College was the first university to license a woman to practice medicine in what was then the British Empire. And her name was Dr. Elizabeth Louise Walker Dunbar. And interestingly enough, I'm sure she was probably very aware about bloodstream infections with puerperal sepsis or childbirth sepsis. But we're looking at the burden of bloodstream infections today. So we know that about 40% of patients presenting with acquired sepsis or septic shock will have associated bloodstream infections. And in intensive care, about 20% of those who acquire sepsis or septic shock will have an associated bloodstream infection. Obviously, because of our hematology cohort of patients, we are particularly interested to know the instance of bloodstream infections. And there's a nice study by Calvera showing this to be 5.4 per 1,000 bed days use. As we're part of the EU, we take part in the European Centre for Disease Control point prevalence studies in healthcare infections, and this was performed just before COVID. And in that, 1.1% of infections that were being treated in hospitals in Europe were bloodstream infections. So it's a very significant burden. Internationally, we know secondary bloodstream infections account up to 8% of bloodstream infections associated in particular with the initial waves of COVID. And that was even higher in a study by Meena associated with the Delta variant in India. And probably most alarmingly was that almost 50% of those were carbapenemase producing Enterobacterales. So locally, we get about 16,000 sets of blood cultures per annum. We have a positivity rate between 11 and 8%. So that generates between 1,500 and 1,800 positive blood cultures for laboratory processing per annum. We're also part of the European Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance Network, and we know from that data that in Ireland, about 6.3% of our E. coli's are multi-drug resistant, that is resistant to 3 or more classes of antimicrobials, and 8.3% of Klebsiella are multi-drug resistant. Ireland has a particular problem with vancomycin-resistant enterococci, and we are reducing our rates, but we are still the highest in Europe at 38.6%. And we have a monthly performance indicator, which is Staph aureus bloodstream infections in our hospitals, and we know that is currently at 0.031 cases per 1,000 bed days used. So we know that bloodstream infections are a particular burden for our healthcare systems. So this schematic is taken from a recent published article from an expert panel looking at the timelines of molecular interventions for blood cultures from the time when sepsis is suspected until there is personalised treatment. And we know that the T2 and the Septifast system can be used initially. After empiric, obviously, antimicrobials are commenced and blood cultures are taken. But most systems rely on incubation at 37 degrees, gram stain adapted treatment, and that it is at this point similar systems such as the ePlex system, which are based on PCR, or the accelerofino, which is based on FISH and morphokinetic cellular analysis, can actually generate a rapid AST. And from there, we have pathogen-adapted treatment and subsequently personalised treatment. So looking at this table, we have a number of methodologies. We can use PCR, we can use FISH, we can use MALDI-TOF. And we know that they have different turnaround times. For example, the FilmArray system has a turnaround time of 1 hour, and I mentioned already the accelerofino for AST would have 7 hours. But as you can see, the sensitivity and specificity in the main perform well, all of the tests. So when you're selecting a rapid molecular diagnostic pathway for your bloodstream infection pathway, you need to consider a number of issues before you commence. And one of those is to divide the blood culture through its journey into 3 phases. The pre-analytical, which is the phase when the blood cultures are taken but before they get to the laboratory. The analytical, which is when they are processed within the laboratory. And then the post-analytical is looking at the implications of the advice given, the cost and the length of stay and the outcome for the patient. So when we decided to look at introducing molecular methodologies, we looked at our ED and we realized that we had a contamination issue there. And the issue was that the contamination of our blood cultures was 11%. So we decided we had to do something about this, and we realized quite quickly that a standard of care is a contamination rate of 3% or less. So what we did was we got the engagement of our colleagues within the emergency or ED department, and we formed the Sepsis Project Pathway team. And as a group, we identified interventions to reduce contamination. And we did this by reviewing and assessing the structures and processes. We engaged with everybody who was involved. We looked at people's ideas, their capabilities, and we also gave them ownership of the issue. And in addition, we provided incentives, positive incentives by looking at the reduction in contamination rates over time, and also the reduction in additional tests required for the patients and additional length of stay. And we found that reducing our contamination rate saved time at the pre-analytical, the analytical laboratory phase, and the post-analytical phase. We actually found by reducing our contamination rate, our laboratory workload was reduced by 50%. So it was an important step that allowed time for us, if we could reduce our contamination rate, to assess molecular methodologies and also obviously to save some money. So 50% of our positive blood cultures from ED were actually contaminants before we started the reduction in contamination rates. So one of the things we did, a very simple measure, was we pulled together a one-stop shop known as the sepsis trolley. We put this in all areas in the ED, and attached to each trolley was the protocols, the sepsis management protocols. This had everything in it that would be required for sepsis management: equipment for IV access, blood culture taking, blood culture sampling, empiric antimicrobials, and protocols, as I mentioned. We had additional interventions such as education and, as I said, feeding back incentives to ensure that the cultural change which we had instigated was to continue. So we then wanted to look at the savings that we had accrued by tackling the contamination issue. So we case matched using the Charleston Comorbidity Index and looked at the reduction in cost, which was most significant between our negative blood culture group and those who had an equivalent case matched by comorbidity had a contaminant. And we found that we were able to save in Argentinian currency just under $1 million per episode. And within a half a year, because we got the contamination rate down to 3%, we were able to eliminate 70 episodes of contamination. And in the subsequent year, we actually found that our contamination rate was lower than 3%. So the subsequent year, we actually saved, in Argentinian currency, 138 million. And we used our costing system, our own financial costing system, case matched, as I mentioned, using the Charleston Comorbidity Index to demonstrate this. So there are significant savings to be accrued by tackling the contamination issue. That allowed us then to look at the different molecular methodologies which were available for blood culture processing. And we decided to look in particular at the GeneMark ePlex. And the reason for that was we had limited, within the laboratory, we had limited time for our biomedical scientists. We had freed up 50% of our processing time blood cultures with a reduction, but we still were limited in staff. And I think this is a real issue, having talked to some of your colleagues here today, for a number of people working in laboratories here in this country. So we wanted a system that was quick, efficient, and we also wanted a system that would interface with our IT systems. So as Adam alluded to, it's a very simple methodology. The cartilage is loaded, it's put into the tower, and then within 90 minutes a result is generated. The technologies enable this with e-sensor and electro-wetting technology. So this looks at where we fitted before we started our journey with our molecular diagnostics, and we would have been in the second bracket here. For a number of years, we already had adapted MALDI-TOF. So we had a system whereby our blood cultures were collected, they were subcultured when the gram stained, and then we did a MALDI-TOF identification, and we used UCAST antimicrobial susceptibility testing. However, by introduction of the ePlex, we hoped to decrease the time to appropriate antimicrobial treatment, reduce the length of hospital stay, and improve our stewardship interventions, and perhaps in some cases infection control, and to improve our patient outcomes. So I'd like to just tell you why we selected the ePlex in relation to the panels. So we have a group of immunocompromised patients from our cancer cohort and from our HIV. So for example, it's very important that we had Listeria monocytogenes as part of the panel. We also have a community whereby we want to capture our community-acquired organisms such as Strep pneumoniae, Group A, and also Streptococcus agalactase. We also were very keen, because we have a low rate of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, or MRSA, we were very keen to be able to have early rule out of MEC-A and MEC-C. So this helped us. And we also, because of the issue with vanc-resistant enterococci, we also wanted to outrule whether Van A or Van B was present. We also liked the fact that we have a large gastrointestinal, colorectal and esophageal cancer unit, and some of those patients have mixed organisms. So it was important to us that there was a PAM gram-negative and a PAN candida within the panel. So with the anaerobic or the gram-negative panel, we were interested in a number of different things, but one of the things which was quite useful during COVID was the anaerobic element. I'm sure many of you found in the early waves of COVID, many young people presenting to critical care area with complicated dental infections such as Lemierre's disease and Ludwig's angina. So we were able to detect Fusobacterium necrophorum. And we also wanted a panel that reflected our immunocompromised population. So we wanted Stenotrophomonas multifilia to be on that panel, because obviously our empiric treatment with piperacillin, tazobactam and amikacin is not the appropriate treatment for that pathogen. So in this population, we wanted to be able to have appropriate treatment as early as possible with cotrimoxazole. We could outrule most of our ESBLs with the CTXM resistance marker. And in Ireland, our CPEs that we get are generally plasmic-mediated OXA48. So it's important to us that OXA was on the resistant determinant panel. However, we do get, obviously, a lot of people returning from travel, and we do occasionally see KPC and NDM, etc. So in relation to the fungal panel, we wanted a panel that had Candida auris, and at the time, this was the first panel which was FDA cleared for Candida auris. There was a particular issue and a number of outbreaks in the UK, which is quite close to us in geography, so we were keen that that would be in the panel. We have an intravenous drug use population around our hospital, so we wanted Candida albicans and glabrata, etc., to be included, and Candida dubliniensis. And we wanted to be able to capture those Candida species which are azole resistant, such as Candida crucei, and those which amphotericin would not be appropriate, such as Candida lusitania. And then again, our immunocompromised population meant that we were particularly keen that we had Fusarium and Cryptococcus within the panel. So this work was carried out by Claire O'Donnell, Oving Griffin and Tanash Power within our laboratory. And this was our initial evaluation. And our aim was to evaluate the rapid laboratory, clinical and antimicrobial stewardship and health economics of the implementation of the GeneMark ePlex rapid identification panels. And what we found was that by using this as part and in addition to our standard of care, we had 50% potential AMS interventions. And they involved 18% early target treatment, 14% early de-escalation, and 18% early rule-out of contamination. So this really helped us improve our sepsis management. It helped with early de-escalation and targeted treatment. For example, if we had an Enterococcus faecalis, we could de-escalate from linezolid to amoxicillin. Similarly, with Staph aureus, we could de-escalate from a glycopeptide to targeted flucloxacillin. And even the small number of rule-out of contamination had potential savings which could be accrued as well. We don't have a huge issue with multi-drug resistant bacteria, but you know, it was very useful to be able to rule these out. So, and we were able to exclude in a number of cases ESBL and CPE. So our findings are mirrored in the literature. This is a nice study and evaluation by Sabrina Byrant from a Grenoble group in France. And when they looked, they had similar results. They found 45% AMS interventions. 7% of the pathogens were not covered by the panels, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's very important to note that to maximise this diagnostic stewardship, you must have an antimicrobial stewardship intervention to maximise savings. The next study is by Block et al., and they looked at an economic model of rapid AST in reducing length of stay. And what they found was that they had a saving of $1,600 per sepsis case and a reduction in length of stay of 7.3%. And if you scale this back to a larger hospital level, it represents in the region of 6 million saved per 100,000 total hospital admissions. So there's significant savings to be made. A lot of these molecular tests are expensive, but you need to put in strategies to reduce that expense by looking at the overall cost savings. So time moves on, and as a family we decided to visit a medieval city in Ireland known as Kilkenny. This is November 2019, and Kilkenny had an outbreak of the Black Death or the plague during medieval times. And this was an exhibit of the plague doctor in full PPE regalia. And I remember at the time having a conversation with my husband about the adequacy of the PPE demonstrated. And I must admit at the time I got a shiver down my spine. So when you think about it, it was November 2019. So we had a lot of concerns going into the initial phases of COVID in relation to bloodstream infection. We had the usual challenges, I think, that everybody around the world had. We had a challenge of acquiring appropriate PPE. We were very fortunate in that we had a situation where one of our Irish rock groups acquired a huge amount of PPE and sent them on a plane to Ireland, and I was asked to assess if it was appropriate PPE. So I had led an infection control for a number of years. So we got the Chinese documentation, we got it translated within 2 hours, and a lot of the PPE at the time that we were seeing was not fit for standard. It was maybe stamped at standard, but actually the documentation wasn't accompanying it, and there hadn't been standardized testing for filtration, penetration, etc. However, we were lucky. This was the good stuff that came on the plane, and we took it. And we introduced universal masking in March 2020 in our hospital. And I was very fortunate because of a number of EU committees that I sit on. I had a colleague who was in northern Italy. And if you will recall, COVID came from China initially and then went to northern Italy. So having talked to him and realizing, that we had no vaccination at this stage, we decided to have universal masking introduced in our hospital for both patients and providers. And we were able to upscale our ICUs as was required, and we had to look at how we could protect our patients and our staff. So one of the things we looked at was patients who were coming into the hospital with sepsis that required treatment, who didn't have COVID. We wanted to be able to reduce their length of stay, to reduce their exposure to the hospital environment. And we knew that we could reduce that with rapid molecular diagnostics by up to 10%. So we were lucky that we were given the opportunity to purchase the ePlex, and we had some experience with it, and we knew that it fitted in with our patient cohort. This was all obviously pre-vaccination. So we also wanted to use it because we wanted to reduce the time. If you recall what I said about sepsis and our empiric antimicrobial treatment, which was piperacillin, tazobactam and amikacin, that's 5 infusions. It requires 13 minutes per infusion to prepare. We were limited with our healthcare workers. We wanted to reduce their time spent on certain activities, and we certainly wanted to reduce the patient and healthcare worker interaction during COVID to reduce risk to both of them. So it was really important to us to get our blood culture molecular diagnostics up and running. So this work was carried out by myself and Ovine Griffith and Annette Parr, who are my colleagues within the laboratory. And in addition to introducing it as part of our pathway, we also introduced an algorithm. And this is a cost-saving algorithm. So we were able to introduce it to actually run it concurrently with our standard of care. And we found that we were able to exclude contaminants, patients were able to go home earlier, we were able to direct treatment and have earlier antimicrobial stewardship interventions. So this is the algorithm. So the algorithm is specific to our institution, and I would recommend, if you are thinking of introducing, or if you haven't done it already, molecular diagnostics in your blood culture pathway, that you consider designing an algorithm. So what we did was we thought about those blood cultures which would have a rapid antimicrobial intervention benefit, and the ePlex was performed in those. So that was all our gram-negatives on gram staining, those that had fungal or yeast on staining, those which were mixed, and also those which had gram-positives from both bottles. We included our hematology, oncology, and ICU patients, and we also included a consultant request, and that's a clinical microbiologist consultant, because sometimes the art of medicine is knowing when something is wrong. We excluded from ePlex testing those that had no antimicrobial stewardship benefit, and they were a single blood culture with gram-positives and a hematology group, because we have a number of different blood culture sets coming from that only had one gram-positive within it. So we had a diverse range of panels used in this part of the study. As you can see, predominantly gram-negative and gram-positive, and about 5% fungal. And just to note, 11% had no targets detected. So we found good concordance when we excluded pathogens which were not on the panel. They're not going to be detected if they're on the panel. We had 100% concordance for our fungal and gram-positive, and 63% for our gram-negatives. So some of the targets we didn't detect were Delphilia acidorum, Acinetobacter, Rhodotorula, a subspecies of Bacteroides, and Pentoa agglomerans. So these are pathogens we don't see that often. So, you know, this system is designed to capture the most common pathogens. And in the gram-positives, we had Paenobacillus provincia, which was probably a contaminant, and Abitrophia defectiva. But we did show early de-escalation in the gram-positive group of 21% and 23% in the gram-negative group, and avoidance of potential toxicity and adverse effect in 16% of the gram-positives and 21%. And this was achieved by stopping the aminoglycoside, stopping the glycopeptide, or in a case where we can't use an aminoglycoside, piperacillin tazobactam, we use a quinolone. And we also had a carbapenem sparing effect. We had 11% carbapenem sparing. So it resulted in early targeted treatment in 63%, and we saw a reduction in time of differential time to resistant determinants and identification of 26 hours. So it was really important to us. It was a valuable tool during COVID. It was saving money, and it was also ensuring safety of both our patients, adequate treatment of our patients, and also safety of our healthcare workers. So we decided to look at savings per 100 gram negative blood stream infections, and we found that they were over 50,000 euro, which is approximately 7 million Argentinian currency. And this is based on an average length of stay from Battle et al. Of 3 days, a reduction in stay. We also were able to show that the introduction of the algorithm reduced our ePlex testing by 37%. So that was an additional cost saving per 100 blood cultures, which flagged positive. And we did the time and motion study, as I mentioned, showing that there was saving of time in relation to preparation of antimicrobials. So during this era, not only were we able to save nurse time in preparation, but we were also able to reduce healthcare worker and patient exposure, which improves safety. Obviously, that's pre-vaccination. So I just thought it's important to know that when you're introducing any system into the laboratory, there is always limitations of a system. So it's important to know that this is a molecular system that is functioning on the genetic level, where our standard of care, in our case, is based phenotypically. So one of the examples just illustrating this is we found that we came across a number of Enterococcus faecium isolates which carried and demonstrated the VAN-A gene. But when we put them through our routine UCAS susceptibility, they were phenotypically susceptible. Gagnon et al. Showed that there's truncations and deletions of the transcriptional regulators, VAN-S and VAN-R, which might be associated with this phenotype that is susceptible, but actually carries the VAN-A cluster gene on the tramposin TN1546. It's also possible that there might be a mixed culture present, but that's less likely. And it's important to note that apart from this limitation, there are limits in what is on the panels, what are the targets for the actual system. So you need to really think about your institution and your requirements within your institution and match those requirements to whichever molecular system you decide to choose for blood culture molecular diagnostics. Also to note, obviously this system and most systems will not detect resistance due to efflux upregulation or pore loss, which is sometimes the case in the Enterobacterialis. So in conclusion, we found that rapid identification using the ePlex system improved our diagnostic stewardship and our antimicrobial stewardship, reduced length of stay. It improved and meant we had earlier antimicrobial interventions. It improved outcomes for our patients. It saved cost and time at the analytical and post-analytical phase and was very useful in early rule-out of contamination. And during the COVID-19 pandemic pre-vaccination phase, it certainly reduced healthcare worker time and contact time, improving safety. I would say if you're planning to introduce such systems, a key thing to do is to review and audit your contamination rate. Because really, I don't think you could start introducing these systems if you had a high contamination rate. And that needs to be addressed. It will save you a lot of money, and it'll actually save you. We were surprised at our savings when we did the initial evaluation, but it is really significant, and it may even help you to be able to acquire some molecular platform from a cost point of view. Very important to compare what's available there to reflect that in your clinical practice, and also important to consider your workflow. As I said, we were looking for a very easy system that we could train people up very quickly and which didn't take away from the normal workflow excessively within the laboratory. You can look at your savings and feed those back. It's always good to get positive feedback. We all like that. So it's very important to do that. And I would say if you're introducing any of these systems that you need to think about designing an algorithm for the laboratory workflow. And we found that very useful. And then, as I said, there may be additional benefits and spin-offs which you wouldn't have expected, which we came across during the early phases of COVID-19. So just in summary, I'd like to acknowledge all the patients of St. James's Hospital and thank them, and all my colleagues who work in the clinical microbiology laboratory and the antimicrobial stewardship team, and all my colleagues within St. James's Hospital in Dublin. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, doctora Boyle. Algunas preguntas de la audiencia. Lo voy a hacer en inglés. So the first question is if you're using these panels as standard of care, and if you're not, what are you using, or if you use it in specific populations in your hospital, and if you could explain a little bit more the workflow using or not MALDI-TOF in your hospital.
So just in relation to the workflow, is it? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the workflow. You have to obviously know what your workflow is initially, and then you have to see how that can be integrated within your workflow. We have the MALDI-TOF, and we use the MALDI-TOF from subculture. That was our standard of care prior to introducing this, and we've continued with that. So what we report, you have to think when you introduce a system about what you're going to report. And what we report as our gold standard is our MALDI-TOF identification and our phenotypic susceptibility using UCAST, okay? Because they're standardized. What we actually use is we use the molecular diagnostics to direct our antimicrobial stewardship, and we've been able to demonstrate that that has been robust, and that's where the savings can be accrued. So we actually have two systems effectively, but one enables earlier antimicrobial stewardship and also reduces length of stay, and we've been able to show it actually reduces cost.
Fantastic, thank you. And there's also one question related to that. It says, how comfortable were the ID physicians that have to de-escalate antibiotics with these results? If it was difficult to convince them that this was a credible result, or there was some resistance from the people that had to take the decision to step down the antibiotics?
Yeah, I mean, I think having talked to Inverna earlier today, the group who are doing such magnificent work, and Fernando, who was talking about this can be a challenge. And I would say that initially it was a challenge within our institution. And part of the reason why I embarked on reducing the contamination issue and reviewing the cost there was, well, number one was to get engagement from our ED colleagues, but actually that was to get engagement from our financial controllers in order to be able to purchase the instrument. So you really have to think about, and one of the, like we have a number of, you know, managerial performance indicators in our hospital, and one of those would be length of stay, or say if a patient is readmitted within 30 days. So if we could show that we were reducing the length of stay, this was a very positive signal to the financial controllers. And I think you have to speak the language of, they speak a different language to us. We're scientific, we're patient-based, you know, we want the best outcomes for our patients, but they speak a different language. And I think you need to start thinking about speaking their language and making them responsible as well for those decisions. So, but we fed back the initial contamination data, and then I suppose events took us over, and we were very lucky. In Ireland, the government, you know, we spent years, we were like kids in a sweet shop trying to get the different platforms, and when COVID-19 came, we were given money to go into the sweet shop and we bought some of the sweets. But we did have experience of the system, so we were able to choose the right system for us. So it's very important maybe to evaluate different systems before you know what's suitable for you. And subsequently, you know, with the introduction of the algorithm, that showed that we were very serious about not, I suppose, wasting money where it wasn't appropriate, and it didn't have an effect. So that also meant that we could show, that was to get the business case, you know, for consumables. We had, the algorithm was very useful for that.
Many thanks, Dr. Boyle. Una pregunta en español, si este dispositivo está disponible en Argentina. Bueno, con los equipos locales está en plan de estar registrado por ANMAT, así que eso de cualquier forma lo puede responder el equipo local. No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta de la audiencia. Si no hay ninguna otra pregunta, solamente decirles si hay algunas dudas o quieren mayor información, vamos a estar en el Salón Álamo del 5º piso, por cualquier consulta, y si no, creo que damos por terminado el simposio. Muchas gracias a todos por asistir. Thanks.